Hello, Choose Life Church and all others who are joining us today. Excited about our journey we're taking this month through the book of Matthew. Today we are on day 22. That puts us in chapter 22. So today is quite an interesting day. In the previous day's reading in chapter 21, it starts this story a little bit. But it talks about the religious leaders, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and there were a lot of them in the crowd the day he's teaching, this particular day that he's teaching. And you can tell that they've gotten together and done some plotting, trying to figure out a way to trip Jesus up by asking him trick questions. That's kind of their goal. Now, if you know anything about Jesus, and we've talked about this before, he had more problem with the religious leaders of his time than anyone else. It didn't bother him to have dinner with a leper or go down to the local tavern and try to, hang out with those people and be a light in that situation. He had no real problem speaking to people who the religious leaders wouldn't even talk to, and on and on and on. So these religious leaders, they just hated him. They didn't want anything to do with him. They didn't believe he was the Messiah. As much as they knew the scripture, they had missed it completely. And so Jesus is at this point admonishing them in kind of a covert way as he's sharing stories with the people he's teaching. So the previous day in chapter 21, the religious leaders have come to him, tried to get him to answer some trick questions. Didn't work out all that well, and he knew there were other religious, the Pharisees and Sadducees in the crowd. So he began to share a story about a great wedding feast. The great wedding feast is all about a wealthy person who is having a big feast for his son who's getting married. He sends out invitations. Many are ignored, many are rejected, and in some, the messengers are treated shamefully and even killed. And basically, he's talking directly to the Jewish people, and particularly the religious leaders. And eventually, in the story, he just invites anyone, people in the fields, people on the streets. He invites anyone who wants to come, which is synonymous with God opening up the kingdom to the Gentiles, not just the Jewish believers, but to the Gentiles. And he makes this statement at the very end of this parable. And he says, many are called, but few are chosen. And he's trying to make it clear that just because you think you're going to get into the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean you will. Especially for those of the religious leader sect who seem to think they could get in by keeping rules and just doing whatever things by rote they could to make themselves seem as if they were religious. So the Pharisees, after hearing this story, they come up with this question about paying taxes. So they knew that the people hated Rome because they were subservient to Rome, and Rome placed heavy burden of tax on them. So they didn't like paying the taxes. So they came up with this trick question that they thought, well, this will surely trip him up, so that if he says one way, the people are going to rebel. If he says another way, there's a no-win situation. So they asked the question, but in the end, Jesus says to them, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. There was no tripping him up on that question. So now the Sadducees, another religious sect, step forward and they say, well, what about this resurrection? Now, I love this one. This one reminds me of the way a non-believer might approach the Bible. And they will try to come up with the wildest questions, track it as far as they can track it to get an answer back that looks like, well, there's no way you can answer this. In the end, it doesn't work. Jesus just shuts them down as quickly as he shut down the Pharisees. And what he said to them in the end was so important. He says, your problem is you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. And this is where I believe that the religious leaders of the time really, really fell down. They really failed. Because the truth is, They were trying to make those scriptures say what they wanted them to say, rather than reading them for what God was saying. And they truly didn't understand the power of God. As we move forward today, continue on our journey, I hope you'll remember it's important that we know the scripture, but it's more important that we know the power of God. Hope you have a great day. Thanks for being here with me. I'll see you soon. God bless.